All right, so in the previous example, I showed you how to declare a controller and bind it to a view, right? A snippet of HTML. And what happens is that now this snippet of HTML, right here, it is the responsibility of that controller, right? They both are going to know about each other, right? So whatever happens to that div, right, the controller knows about, right? And whatever the controller does, the div knows about. There's going to be a double binding between these two, right? They're going to intimately know about each other. Now, the controller is not going to be responsible for the HTML. So the controller's responsibility, its concerns are not how the page is rendered. Okay? It doesn't care about the HTML, the CSS, the layout. That's the responsibility of the HTML side, the view. The view's concerns are how things are laid out, right? How things look and how pretty they are. The controller is not concerned with any of this, right? It is only concerned of the data flow that goes between these two worlds, right? If the view is generating any data, the controller wants to know about it, right? And the controller is also can go the other way around. It can generate the data that the view can render. Right? So let's see how they can talk to one another. So for instance, one thing that they can have is that the controller has a limited responsibility. It is only responsible for this div. It is not responsible for anything outside of this div. Okay? It is only bound to this div. It has its scope, right? It only knows about that portion of the HTML. Okay? So because this is the scope of the controller, right? There is a magic variable that allows you to bind these two worlds, right? And by fate is called the scope variable. Okay? And the name is apt. Right, the things that binds the two worlds, right, the world in the controller and the world in the HTML, is the scope, right, or the subset, right, of concern for this controller. Okay, and it has this specific name. It starts with $, and it has the word scope. Okay, and it has to be written in that way. Okay, it has a special name, and this is as magical as any other variable that you might have encountered in any other framework, right? If you've done ASP or if you've done JSP or PHP or Python, or you might have found some of these around, right? JSP certainly has quite a few. It has the application variable, the request, the response, right? All these are variables that are declared at a higher level, right? There's somebody, we are but only a little piece of a larger infrastructure, yes? We are a little piece of JavaScript running in a larger framework, right, that declares all this around us, right? By the time we implement this controller, we can ask to be connected to that larger framework, right? It's part of a technique referred to as component technology. Right? In component technology, and computer scientists have been in the Holy Grail looking for a sometimes referred to as the software bus. Right? Like other industries, like the especially the electronic industry, they have lots and lots of standards that allow many different components to be plugged in, right? And all of a sudden they just talk to one another, right? If everybody follows a particular architecture for certain processors or for certain CPUs or for certain boards, right? You can just create all sorts of graphics boards and sound boards and all sorts of things that you can just plug in and they just work, right? USB and or FireWire or all these standards allow many different devices to talk to one another, right? If everybody follows the same standard, you can play in the infrastructure. Yes, same. So that's the computer scientists have been trying to replicate that kind of idea, right? That would it be great if we could just drop components and they just work, right? Into a software bus and things talk to one another. So in that in that same theme, Angular has borrowed many ideas from these other industries, right? That allow you to drop in certain components that they just work, right? As long as you know what the points of interface, how they work, right? $sign scope is one of those, right? Its responsibility is to shuffle data back and forth between two worlds, right? Between the HTML world and the JavaScript world, right? That's its life, right? Its only purpose is to send data to the HTML or send data from HTML back to the controller, right? That's its purpose. So let's start using it. So for instance, instead of this alert, we can use scope and say we can declare a variable on the scope, for instance. Okay, and the way this works is that anything that is declared on the scope, it can be viewed from either world, right? From the HTML world, I can now all of a sudden have access to this data, this piece of data, right? And vice versa, right? The view can also declare things on the scope, right? And then the controller would see it, right? So for instance, now that I've declared this variable on the scope, now the HTML can see this string, right? So on the login, right? On the login, I can now refer to that variable. I can refer to hello here on the HTML. Right? If I refresh my login page, that's not quite what we wanted. Right? So this is being interpreted by the browser as just plain text. Yes. So somehow we need to be able to tell it, hey, this is not plain text. Right? This is not just HTML text. This is actually data. Right? So to distinguish between literal text and variables that have a value that needs to be evaluated, we come up with an escape sequence, a character escape sequence that says, hey, don't interpret this as literal text, right? It's actually a variable that is referring to some piece of data, okay, which is being declared elsewhere, right? The controller is declaring that piece of data. See that? So if I re-render, right, notice that this says now it's hello from controller. See that? Right. So the controller declared the variable, and now the HTML can see it. So it's the controller sent data to the view, and now the view can render it. Right? But the data can flow both ways. Right? The HTML can also declare variables, right? And they would be sent over to the controller, right? So let's look at how the view could do that as well. So for instance, how could the HTML generate any data here? Well, these input fields could be a good idea, right? That could generate whatever I type here. Perhaps I'm generating data. I'm inputting data, right? So I could generate just like the controller could declare a variable. I could assign a variable name to this input field, right? And say, hey, here's a piece of data for you, right? And I can give it a name. And the way we do that is by using another Angular attribute called the ng model attribute. Right? It's saying I am going to declare a variable, right? And anybody who wants to know about it, that's the name I'm giving it. I'm going to give it the name username. Okay, pretty good. And so the controller is going to be able to see this. And actually, everywhere is going to be able to. Everybody is going to be able to see this this new variable. Anywhere where it's referenced, this variable will be visible, including the controller, right, if the controller cares to see it. Anybody who declares interest in this variable will be notified if this variable changes. Right? For instance, if I anywhere I go and I declare this variable, username, right? If I render it, that's not what I wanted. So I want to say that this is a variable. This is a variable. Who declared it? Not the controller. The controller didn't declare this, right? The HTML declared it. The view declared this, right? So if I render it, notice that if I start typing at it, the data is propagated to anybody who has established any interest in this variable, right? So somehow the ones who are observing the data are being notified, right, that the data has changed, right? And those who have declared any interest in this data are responsible for updating themselves or doing whatever they would want to do with the data, right? In this case, the proper thing to do would be to update the rendering of that piece of data, right? If it changes, that should change too. Everybody okay? It could be rendered and styled any which way you want. You might want to put this in an H3. Oops. Right, H3. I can't type. Right, so that as I type, notice that it renders the text appropriately. Okay.
This text be rendered somewhere else, so the user doesn't.
Anywhere you want.
So you can technically spy on people.
I'm sorry. Well, only the user can see this, right?
Oh.
Yeah, only users typing this, right? Yeah. And typically the controller is seeing it too, right? And yes, it is anything you've downloaded from a public place, right? You by navigating to that site, you are entrusting that site, right? Whether you actually trust it or not, that's the responsibility of the user. Whether you actually go to Bank of America or not, and they trust their information. If not the whole page, only that little portion is being rendered. Yep. Yeah. Notice that the page has never left, right? Notice that if you look at the network, there is completely silent, right? The server has absolutely no idea that this is happening, right? The page is being updated on the spot, right? We're manipulating the DOM right now dynamically. Everybody okay? Everybody still with me? All right, awesome. Okay, so these are somewhat silly examples. Let's do something a little more interesting, such as being able to submit this data to the controller, so the controller can do something with this data, right? Some logic, and let's do that next.